Thank you to everyone who came out on the Graduate Student Friday night. This is really awesome. We have Hannah Grobmyer here, and she is a 2016 MBA, and she is working at, Hannah, can you say the name?
Kepler Group.
The Kepler Group. Okay. Would you like to start off by just giving us a brief description of what you do?
Yeah, for sure. I tried to pull together slides from some of our various training decks, but I'll probably just speak to it instead. Maybe I'll jump in a little bit, but so I work in digital advertising. Kepler Group is a digital agency. We're based in a couple of different cities. I'm based out of Philly. We also have New York, Chicago, San Francisco, London, Costa Rica, and recently Singapore. So we're all over, but we're pretty small. So we're about 400 person agency. But when I started, I think I was like the 90th employee. So ton of growth over the past couple of years. And I started at Kepler right out of Eisenberg. So I've been there for almost 5 years, which is a long time in the agency world. But I figured I could talk to you all a little bit about what it is to be at an agency, and then specifically a digital advertising agency, how that all kind of fits together. I know when I was at Eisenberg, I was a marketing focus. And I felt like at the time, even graduating, I wasn't really sure what that meant for the ecosystem, and sort of like, what are the jobs that are out there? You know, what does my degree qualify me for? What would I be interested in? And so I sort of lucked into Kepler, but I thought it would be helpful to talk to you all about what it is we do, and then like how that all fits together. So Wendy, I can just jump right in if you're good with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead and share your screen. Hannah's going to take us through a little bit of like introduction to marketing and navigating the world of marketing.
Yeah, so I have a couple slides. We'll see, I may jump around, but so what Kepler does, just first off, this is a view of sort of different types of agencies. So I guess from a high level, I work in advertising, which is a sort of subset of marketing. Marketing you can think about as sort of, it could be in-house marketing for a brand. It could be really anything to do with bringing in customers, meeting business goals, driving awareness, all of the sort of various aspects that marketing encompasses. Advertising is a specific subset of that, in that we are actually sort of like a paid approach to media, which I can also talk through in a little bit. But what we do as an agency at Kepler is we're digital. So we're focused on anything. I might even have a slide for this. A second here. As I said, I pulled these from other things. So just to sort of show different various types of advertising, I would say digital advertising is actually everything at this point. So this is all different ways you can think about advertising, from Facebook to search ads to online video to billboards. You might see what we call out of home, which is billboards, print, anything like that. But it can actually all be digital now. So we can buy that billboard that you see here is actually a digital billboard. So we can buy it using data on things like where people are traveling. So if I want to find women who are 20 to 30 and interested in fitness, I can actually find the areas of space that audience is most likely to travel through, and then buy digital billboards that follow them along that route. So digital is really touching really every kind of advertising at this point. And then what we do at Kepler is we're connecting the dots for our clients and actually buying the media. So what that means is we're getting briefed by the client on what they care about, what their goals are, what they're trying to drive with their advertising. Then we're finding their target audience wherever they might be, whether that is Facebook or YouTube or a digital billboard, and then actually buying that media and then reporting on the results of that media as to whether or not it drove the client's goal. So if they're trying to drive sales, we can actually track whether someone saw the ad and then actually bought something on the website. Or if it's a financial client, they saw our ad and then they submitted a lead for a credit card. So whatever the client's goals might be. So my role at Kepler is I'm a client solutions director. So my role is really the liaison between the client and then our media buying team, which also sits within the Kepler agency. So a lot of my work is sort of understanding client goals, communicating the story, talking about the results of the campaigns, how they performed, how we are or aren't meeting goals, how we're adjusting our plans for future campaigns. I kind of threw a lot at you guys, so I'll pause and see if there's questions about that. If you want me to kind of dive into any of that in more detail, I'm happy to.
Hannah, how many clients do you work with like at the same time? I can only imagine this is obviously a lot to manage one company's portfolio work. So how many do you get to kind of have in your portfolio?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we work with at Kepler really large clients. So I can share again. This is just sort of a sampling of the different types of clients we work with. So they're really typically like large Fortune 500 or enterprise style clients. So the budgets we're working with could be like millions of dollars a month in media. And so our model is typically that you're working with only a couple of clients at a time. So some agency models where it might be lower touch or smaller clients, you could have a ton of clients. I personally really like our small agency approach because I want to get deep with one of these clients. I want to know their business. And I think that's also the value of the MBA is that I feel like I have a greater business sense of just how all these things work together, how I can support their business strategically. And so like for me personally, I work across Bed Bath & Beyond and then A Place for Mom, which is a senior care services, sort of like middleman between families and then communities. And those two clients are like plenty in terms of how it takes up my time. So the more senior we are in the company, the more likely we are to be spread across multiple because it's just not the same types of things that you're working on. When I came in more entry level, I was definitely like fully dedicated to one account, spending all of my time there. Whereas now I'm on two and oversight on a third. So it's kind of more spread out.
Excellent.
Hannah, thank you for walking us through that. I know that you have very large clients right now, but it wasn't always the case, right? When you started, they were Kepler Group was on the smaller side, and you had mentioned something that I thought could be useful for those trying to break into the marketing field, and that's to look for some smaller companies that have the right feel. Do you want to talk to the group about that?
Yeah, for sure. I kind of alluded to this when I said like, well, 400 people seems like a lot. And we were less than 100 when I started, which in my mind is like, that's almost a startup. Like you're just past your startup phase if you're 100 people. And you know, that's a ton of growth in those couple of years. But for me, especially starting in the Philly market, which is obviously a smaller market than New York for us, New York is our largest office. There were 5 people literally in the Philly office when I interviewed, and I interviewed with every single one of them. And it was just a very personal connection. I mean, I know I said to you, Wendy, when we were talking, I found personally the application process really frustrating in the moments where I was like, I'm not even going to get an in-person interview. I know I'm not going to get to talk to someone. And that's tough because, you know, your resume doesn't say everything about you. And so for me, finding that a smaller company where I was like, you know, they're not going to use some sophisticated software that's going to flip through resumes and go right past mine. They're going to look at it and they're going to see me as someone that they can speak to. And then once I got in the door, at least for me personally, that's when I feel like you can really determine for yourself and they can determine if you're the right fit. But I also mentioned, and I think this is an important point, even Kepler has evolved in our hiring practices over the past 2 or so years. We used to very much hire even at the sort of entry level for like Ivy League, had an internship in the specific industry, like very specific check the box things. And we've since learned like that was really a detriment to our company and a detriment to our culture. We're not as diverse as we wanted to be. We were not, both in sort of our makeup and also in our thinking. And so like, I felt lucky because with an MBA, I came in at an entry level role with an MBA because I was just like happy to get my foot in the ground in somewhere that was in the industry I wanted. And I was able to advance quickly because of the MBA. But I think had I not had that, I might have even not gotten hired at that entry level. And we've since learned that, having an Ivy League education or having the right internships is not the thing that makes someone successful in the role. And we've really moved away from that as our hiring benchmark, to the degree that we say, like, don't even think about education. Like, we have people who don't even have undergraduate degrees who are really thriving and successful. So I think, and I hope that more companies are moving in that direction and understanding that, it's to everyone's benefit, the company, the culture, the world, to not have such a narrow focus on how you hire.
Krista, I'm sure you can recall that Demarosa, our recent speaker, just was talking about that, how it was either Google or Facebook, how they dropped the requirements for some Ivy League schools and in their AI program, so that more people can have an opportunity to interview. But when you were searching for Kepler Group, what was the search criteria? I know that you said you were looking for entry level. We get that, especially me, because when you're trying to change fields. But what other search criteria were you looking at, and how did you finally land that one that took you in?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, this takes me back to, like, I didn't even know what the ecosystem looked like. Like, I was just really, okay, I have a marketing degree. Like, what do I use it for? I found myself interviewing for so many jobs that I thought were marketing and turned out to be sales, which is something to keep in mind as you're looking for internships and for jobs. Sales is very different than marketing. It's very different than advertising. They all sort of have their niche areas. Obviously all those things are marketing, but in very different ways. So for me, I went to a lot of interviews that I had high hopes for, and then got through and was like, I don't want to cold call people for a year, or I don't want, or even, I'm not even putting down sales jobs. It was just truly not what I wanted. One, and two, I knew that even to pivot within a company from sales to something else, like, I just didn't want to go down that path and have to find it that way. So Kepler popped up for me as I was starting to learn how to read job descriptions, and like, okay, this is not that. This is not a sales job. This is something totally different. I didn't know anything really about advertising. What drew me to it is I thought, okay, well, digital, which means I know it's tech heavy, which was something I was interested in. And I kind of felt like I had a tech feel. I kind of felt like I had a social media feel and had some experience there. Little did I know, like, I had no experience there. I thought I did. And so that it was sort of reading between the lines of the job descriptions. But at the same time, I was also interviewing for those really large agencies that I talked about. So if we think about the ecosystem, most of the advertising work out there and most of the companies are part of giant holding companies. So these huge agencies that basically buy up little local agencies, group them all together, and they kind of have specialties, but they're under these huge umbrellas. And I interviewed with some of those as well. And what I found is they did feel less personal. The environment felt much more like, okay, I'm going to be a strategist. And then what that really means when I get into the interview is I'm going to look at Excel all day, every day for weeks on end. Whereas with a smaller agency, I felt like, okay, they're too small to have one person staring at Excel all day. I need to wear a lot of hats. And that's the kind of job I was looking for, especially with an MBA, where I felt like, well, I have something to contribute from a knowledge of business perspective and a greater strategy perspective. So that's you'll see Publicis Health or Publicis Media, Omnicom, the others aren't coming to me, but there's these massive holding companies. And I do recommend those in some ways because there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of ways to say, I'm going to start in digital and then I'm going to end up over here. I'm going to end up in creative, or, whereas for me, I very much digital that's the only roles there are because that's what we do. But then I also think that in terms of the ecosystem, a lot of people go from an agency to a client. And so the other marketing side of things is working in-house for one of those brands that I had, or any brand you can think of. They're all going to have in-house marketing teams. It's a little bit harder to break in at the client side because that's where either you're starting in like an unrelated role or a much more entry level role, or they're looking for someone who has a bit more experience. Typically, because even for some of those big companies that I was talking about, their marketing team or their advertising team internally is going to be like 5 people, even if it's a massive company, which is surprising to hear, but it's really true. So that's where I think agencies are a good place to start, because there's much more open roles and you learn a ton. It's super fast paced. There's always people who know more than you. And that's, at least for me, that's the environment I want to be in. And then a lot of people do pivot to client side. It typically has like a bit more of a slower pace, just kind of like not quite as like hectic all in as an agency is, in terms of like culture.
You talk about culture, and I know that you said you have benefited from being at a small agency, and how has not only your sort of untraditional path through Eisenberg, because you took a mixture of undergraduate and graduate classes, correct? And you also took some sport dual classes, right? So that's a very unique way of going through your MBA. How has that breadth of knowledge helped you in such a small, helped you like sort of grow and be a bigger part of such a small agency, right? Do you find that it's allowed you to participate more in conversations that maybe you wouldn't normally?
Yeah, I mean, I think I alluded to like advancing quickly. I think having an MBA, but being willing to start at the ground level of whatever industry you're moving into, especially if you are changing industries, I highly recommend it. I learned so much so quickly. I see people come in at more senior levels, like mid-level-ish, and struggle because every company does things differently and every industry is slightly different. And it's just like hard to kind of transition. So I really appreciated that process of like learning and growing quickly. But again, I work at a small agency where they are more open to, if you're performing at the level above you, we're going to put you at the level above. Whereas it is true that in a more traditional space, you have to go through the paces. You're certainly not going to get promoted before a year, and you're probably going to need to have like multiple different bosses and multiple different performance reviews. Like in a small startup environment, it's much more like, if you can prove it, like you're going to get there. So that was valuable for me. But in terms of coursework that got me where I am, I think as I said, I really didn't know what was out there. So that was the thing that was, I think, lacking for me, is just an understanding of the ecosystem. I think what was beneficial that I didn't even know was going to be beneficial was just how to think. Like the value I bring to my clients now is not just from the lens of, I know digital marketing really well or digital advertising really well. It's, I know how to think like a business, and I know how to think about how all these things connect and what's on your mind, and, how you're, like, for instance, I said I work with Bed Bath & Beyond. Like, I listen to their investor calls. And so I hear them talk about, their supply chain and how that's impacting their bottom line sales, or the fact that, people that buy online are less profitable to them because of the cost to ship the goods. So like just sort of things that make sense to me naturally, having gone through an MBA program, that I think make me better at my job, even though I may not be using all those skill sets in everyday conversation.
And how did you choose those courses, and who did you work with? Like going into the second year when you have a little bit more freedom, who did you work with? Did you put something together on your own, or did you choose from listed electives?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely I chose from listed electives. I felt like I came into Eisenberg with a little bit of marketing experience, but not a ton. I thought I wanted to focus on consulting. And then as I sort of got into the coursework and passed my internship, I kind of realized that I was more interested in the marketing side of things. I think I chose things that I felt like would be tangibly practical for me. I think I was telling you one day I took a course called like Intro to Internet or Internet Business or something, which I thought sounded super outdated at the time, but it was actually probably the closest in terms of relevance of what I do now, although I didn't know it at the time. I was into analytics, I was into research. And so like, I felt like there was sports courses that like dove a little bit more into research, or there was undergrad courses that dove a little bit more into, as I said, like the internet side. So like, I think it was just kind of leaning into things that I was passionate about, was sort of how I selected that.
Thank you. That is very helpful. I'm praying my dogs don't bark. They were just barking crazy. Does anybody have any questions? I think, we're almost at halfway, and I like to open up for some questions for Hannah. Anybody? Bueller? Okay. Well, I have a question. Should I go with the failure question? We're always talking about failures. I mean, and normalizing failure, at least in the circle of, at least in my circle. So and they always ask you in interviews, tell me about a time that you failed. But let's talk about a failure. What does that look like in the advertising industry, especially at a small agency where maybe the impact could be a little bit bigger, and how does that agency respond?
Yeah. Oh, there's so many ways I could talk about this. So, I'll start with the job that I had before I went to Edinburgh. I was working very closely with basically one person. I started as an assistant, and then I moved into like a marketing role for him. And it was just not at all the right job fit for me. Like I'm not a good assistant. It's a very challenging job, to be honest. And like, it was not a good fit for me. But I think at the time I really latched onto like this personality thing where I was like, we don't mesh. I'm struggling to like sort of meet his needs. Like, it was very classic, like what you picture an executive assistant going through. Like, I just was like, I can't handle this. But what's interesting looking back on it is I realized there was some points of failure of expectation and sort of going the extra mile. What I've learned in my current role, where I feel like I've sort of settled into a career path, is if you care about something and you're dedicated to it and you want to do your best and you're trying to grow and you have a growth mindset, like, you find ways to find solutions. You figure out where there's going to be issues and you preempt them. You just kind of find ways to lean in and go the extra mile. And that is not me making a case for like overworking at all. It's more just about dedication. And I look back on that job and I realize there's a lot of things I could have done better. And I sort of had the excuse in my head of like, this is just not the right personality fit, or, I didn't go the extra mile. And that would kind of come back as like, fueling the fire of it not being a good working relationship. But I didn't realize that until really like years later, where I'm now like, wow, that was a first job. Like, I really did not know what I was doing. Like, okay, I blamed him and I just as easily could have blamed myself. But then I think in terms of like failures within my industry, an interesting thing for me. So we spend client money. I mean, I said it's millions of dollars a month. Like, we are responsible for where those dollars go, how they perform, are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? And so, as you can imagine with that, when there are errors, those errors have a pretty big impact. So we, if we make a mistake, we pay the client back out of our Kepler money for the mistakes that we make. So, and we're not big where we have that sort of like supporting system that can kind of like step in when those things happen, in terms of financially, at least. But what's been interesting for me in that is not the process of like, we made a mistake, let's beat ourselves up about it. It's the process of like, how did it happen? How do we make sure it doesn't happen again? And what's interesting to me is it's actually now, as a leader, helping others through that situation. So I'm not the one who's typically making those mistakes anymore, just because I'm not the one who's actually spending the dollars physically in the platforms anymore. But so what I find myself in situations of is people, there's like kind of two sides of it. There's people that make mistakes and completely beat themselves up about it and like can't get over it. And it's like, you're a great employee. You're going to get past this. Like, don't worry about it. These things happen. And then there's the other side of it where I work with people who don't understand the implications, brush it off and keep moving. And I have to sit down and say, here's the implications. I had to write a very difficult email to the client. I had to have a very difficult conversation with the client. I'm the person that this comes back to, not you. Like, you are shielded from the impacts of this mistake. So here's all the things I had to do. And then Kepler as a company had to be responsible for that. So it's sort of like walking through the implications to then help people understand the importance of it and put in processes to make sure those things don't happen in the future. So I know that's not quite what you were getting at in terms of like failure is a good thing, but it is an important thing to think about, like implications, what it looks like, taking responsibility, sort of seeing it through from start to finish.
Yeah, I mean, I think you gave it the attention it was due. It's part of a process, right? And it's really just sort of how you come out the other side. But so I say hindsight is 2020, right? And it looks as though you are taking the lessons of the past and applying them to the next generation. Speaking of the next generation, what does the next 5 years of marketing look like in your agency? What's on the burner for Kepler Group?
Yeah, so the industry is changing actually quite a bit, and it's even touching sort of like mainstream news. So I'm sure some of you are hearing about some of these things just because it's starting to come at us from all angles. So privacy is a huge topic of discussion across the world right now. It started in Europe with GDPR, which was basically privacy compliances for citizens so that their data is protected on the internet. Which is a very good thing and probably long overdue that there are regulations for these kind of things. It then moved to the US with CCPA, which is the California version of that. And it's now rolling out in many, many different ways. But I can just sort of give a peek behind the curtain for what this means for digital. So the way that we are able to find people that are meeting our target audiences that we think are going to convert for our clients is using data across the internet. So tracking how those people are interacting across different websites and where they're purchasing or what they're looking at or what they're searching or what their friends are searching. We don't have visibility into all of those things. That's obviously behind the scenes with all of the platforms and their algorithms. And we're not actually seeing, like Wendy looked at these things. We're just seeing, here's 1 million people who fall within your target audience of someone who's interested in yoga or whatever it is. But what these privacy changes do is they very much limit the A to B. So what they're trying to do is say, it's your private information. The actions that you take over here should not be tied to the actions you take over here. So what that means for us is it's much harder to find people who are within your target audience. And then it's much harder to understand whether once you found them, did they take an action and sort of convert the way you wanted them to. So it's been very much a challenge for us. We are a company built on transparency and good business practices, and we understand that good marketing should benefit the consumer. And so we're all for things that are improving consumer privacy and sort of advancing those efforts. And then what it comes down to is just how do we get creative and adapt to an industry that's changing so much. But I actually think we're really well suited for it because we have always been interested in innovation and finding the next thing. And now that just happens to be a pretty transformational thing that's impacting pretty much all of advertising. You'll probably see it in your own ways, in your own devices and the ads that you're served. It's definitely going to change. Think about for yourselves when you're browsing Instagram and you see an ad and you're like, how did they know that I needed like a portable dog bowl? Like, I don't understand, but like, there are so many signals that tell us that you need a portable dog bowl. And that's going to change a little bit.
Yes. I don't know about anybody else, but as soon as I buy something, and if it's like over $100 or if it's a large order off of Amazon or a birthday present, something, all of a sudden I'm inundated with emails because they think I'm flush with cash and I'm like, no, that's not the case. But that's really great information. And I'm wondering two things. How do you know that your clients are sort of on the same page with privacy and integrity and upholding, data privacy laws, how do you know that they are on the same page as you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. There's like multiple parts to this. In some ways, it is the client's responsibility that the way that they are handling and using data and customer information is following laws. And we write our contracts in a way that we're not liable if they are making mistakes with their data. But of course, there are ways that's, we want to make sure we're on the same page. So good example of that is we might make a recommendation and say, you need to change XYZ things before this policy goes into place. And they might say, nope, we're going to wait. We'll take the risk. And like, we can't force them to make that change. We can just do our due diligence of telling them that is, the recommendation. So that happens a lot. The other place that this happens where we may differ from our client is things like brand safety. So we spend a lot of time making sure that their ads are not going to serve somewhere that might not be brand appropriate. But our level of risk might not be the same as their level of risk. So while we would say, don't serve on these sites or don't serve next to this type of content, they might say, we don't care, we're willing to take the risk. So we kind of have to follow their lead. But I will say, again, it's very important to me to work with an agency who has values and sort of has standards, which plays out in a couple of different ways. We choose our clients the same way they choose us. So we go through request for proposal processes and business development pipelines, and we pitch clients actively to get new business. But if throughout that process, it doesn't feel like it's going to be a good fit for us, we won't move forward. And some of those things are, what are their policies around brand safety, or what are their policies on, consumer privacy, or what are they like as a team? Are they going to be too challenging to work with? And we're putting our people in a position where it's not going to be a positive client agency relationship.
Has it ever happened under your watch?
Yeah, I mean, we got pretty close to rolling off a client that the relationship just wasn't working. We actually ended up having our CEO step in and like rebuild us and totally sort of change the person that we were working with, the process, because he was like, I'm not willing to put my people through this. So either we're going to roll you off as a client or we're going to make these changes, which, I'm just super grateful to work for someone who is willing to take those steps. I've also seen business development stuff where we just said, we don't want to move forward. So it definitely has happened even in my visibility.
Well, thank you for teaching us all what rolling off means.
Yes. Rolling off, offboarding, onboarding, all of the acronyms. Digital is full of acronyms and jargony business phrases.
Thank you. I'm going to pause right now. Does anybody have any questions before we get on to some?
Yeah, I do have a question.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here, Anna. So when you were looking at those entry-level positions, was that a time when you felt when the employee felt like you were overqualified because of your education? And if so, like how did you get through that?
It's a great question. And I always feel like that's such a frustrating response. Like, let me decide if I'm overqualified. You don't tell me that. But I know that employers say that. I'm trying to think when or if it happened to me. I think in this case, in the job that I'm in, that did not happen. I think they were just eager that someone wanted the job that had a graduate degree. Although we definitely were less established sort of at the time. I think we actually now will move people into different roles within our hiring pipeline. If we feel like they're a better fit, we'll kind of like nudge a candidate. So like either up a level or down a level or even into a different department. Like, you're great, not a good fit for this, but why don't you apply for this? So I would hope that companies do a better job of that. But in terms of the overqualified, I feel like it's usually code for something else that they're not telling you. But I would just say, if you feel like it's a good fit, I don't think there's any harm in at least giving that context of why you are applying for a role, even if it feels like you're overqualified. So, taking the minute to, couple of minutes to write an email or call our hiring manager or a recruiter and say, I'm applying for this role because, I feel like I need a foundational understanding of the technology, or I feel like because I'm starting in a new industry, I want to learn from the ground up, and sort of give them the context for why you're applying.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Awesome.
Hannah, do you ever feel like with, thinking about digital marketing, there's so many platforms and so many avenues to it. Do you ever, how much research does the agency have to do on up and coming platforms, or do clients typically say, like, have we thought about this? Like, what is this? Because obviously like TikTok's relatively new and brands are just now heading in that direction. And just thinking about like, what is the process for kind of vetting new platforms and if they're efficient for certain brands?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I know that I mentioned agencies typically are better breeding grounds for knowledge and education than being client side. We benefit from each other's work. So a lot of cross-team knowledge sharing, a lot of, vendor capability pitches and conversations where we might not have tested with TikTok, but someone else at the company has, and we can go to them and say, tell us about it. What'd you learn? Should we test or should we wait? So a lot of that, I feel like I've always been empowered to like sort of go for it in terms of, let's at least talk to this partner. Let's learn about it. Again, I know I keep harping on this, but agencies that are much more siloed have a much bigger challenge with that. A lot of digital agencies or traditional agencies, even, I say traditional, that means like TV, print, out of home is typically considered traditional, are very siloed in how they manage media. So you'll have a search management team and they only do search engine marketing, and you'll have a social team and they only do like Twitter and Facebook, and you'll have an email team. And that structure, I think, typically is more challenging to break into new things because there's like an ownership question of like, who's going to learn that? Who's going to manage it? How are we going to buy when we don't have the expertise? Whereas the way our agency is structured is we have a client team and we have a media buying team, which is optimization and innovation is the name of that department. But within that, we all manage everything. We all understand all the full ecosystem. We're all cross-trained in every platform, which helps us be confident in, oh yeah, we could learn that. Like this team manages like search, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, like they could learn anything. Like they already know all of those platforms anyway. So we also call that growth mindset, which is just, it's part of our sort of like capabilities that we use to evaluate performance. Like it's very important to us. And growth mindset is willingness to learn, wanting to grow, being curious about new things. So we sort of build it into our culture.
I like that.
And yes, we do have clients testing TikTok and
Reddit
and like all the things.
We had an alum from Ocean Spray, and she had brought up that they kind of fell into TikTok, right? Because they had someone go viral with their product, and now they're running with it. And And I posed a similar question, like, and she didn't think that they would even really dabble there if they didn't have the original success of having something take off in that space. But now it's definitely a relevant part of their digital footprint. And
a lot of that too is we will bring things to our clients because we have a focus on innovation, and they will often say no. And that's like coming from the client side, it's challenging to take the risk. But it's our job to give them all the information. So we have research tools that tell us, this is your target audience. They're 90% more likely to be active on TikTok than the general population. You should be spending it TikTok. So if we can show them the data and prove that it's going to be a valuable place for them, we can start to build the buy-in. But then of course, it's ultimately going to be up to them and what they're willing to try or not try.
Sure.
Anybody else before I ask a question? So TikTok, 20 seconds or less, storytelling sort of platform out there, right? And it's pretty effective. I don't use it, but I have an 18-year-old who's on it all the time, and she learns a lot. So, and now that they're starting to have or they're experimenting with a platform where you can purchase off of TikTok. So how do you tell a story, an effective story, in 20 seconds or less? Do you have to make multiple videos? Do they build on top of each other? But I mean, this is part of a broader question, right? As we talk about storytelling and your role at the Kepler group and helping others tell stories. But what is effective storytelling? How do you build it? And if you have any idea on how to do it in 20 seconds or less, that would be great information too.
Yeah. Well, I will say I am not in the creative field. So there are other agencies who are creative agencies whose job it is to figure that out. But there are like sort of best practices that we tend to share with our clients as like take this to your creative team. We're the media agency, so we can say, this is what has performed well, or we've seen this be successful, or the platforms recommend this, and then they take that to their creative teams. Or sometimes we have direct communication with the creative as well. So branding in the first 5 seconds, which is like, do we know who you are? Because people may drop out after that, especially in a platform like YouTube where it's skippable. And then there's like a couple of things. So like you can use a narrative arc the way you would use like a traditional storytelling narrative arc, but you have to have a really compelling story. So like a good example is like Budweiser is like they always often use that sort of like storytelling, as does like Nike. But then some brands that don't necessarily have that awareness or buy-in from their consumers, like maybe can't use that style because just people aren't going to stick with them. So it kind of depends. Digital is very into bite size. So the new thing is like, not new, but one of the things is like 6 seconds. Like how quickly can you say this thing? Like not even 20, but 6, which is a specific format in YouTube that is like actually specifically exactly 6 seconds. So yeah, I mean, it kind of differs, but I think the other thing you were talking about is just storytelling in general. So I think like where I said how to be persuasive to a client, like that's much more where storytelling comes into play for my job, which is how do I bring to life our recommendations or our results, or get buy-in on things, or talk through sensitive subjects or difficult subjects in a way that's going to resonate. I literally just led a training today for an internal team about how to do that effectively. But I think the first thing I always say is like, think about your audience. So how technical are they? How senior are they? How much do they already know versus are they brand new to the subject? So just always sort of framing that and then building your story around how you're going to resonate with that person. How you want to tell it doesn't matter. It's how they're going to interpret it that matters. And so really thinking about it with that lens. But that's pretty much in various different ways, like the core function of what I do is like how to interpret, like how to take complex things and find ways to communicate them back to clients. And then similarly, how to take what they're telling me about their business and translate it back to my team. So it's kind of a give and take.
Hannah, do you script your calls with clients?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that question.
Do you script your calls with clients, or at what level of detail do you kind of plan and structure?
Yes, good question. I am very much an off-the-cuff person in general, but I think it is a very person-to-person thing to think about. So I do best when I know the content really well and think through the things I want to hit on first, but I don't rehearse it and I don't script it, because if I do, I find that I get a little bit tight and like I can't just communicate. And to me, like that open communication is super important. But I've learned over the course of being a people leader that not everyone works that way. And it's super important to figure out what your personal style is for how you're going to best communicate information. And I've worked with a lot of people who report to me who are like, they need the time, and we'll spend a ton of time prepping ahead, and I'll have them say it to me, and then I'll give them feedback, and then they'll say it again, and then I'll give them notes, and they'll say it again, and they'll write it all out. And then they nail it. So I think, everyone's a little different. But typically, if you're reading from a script, people know you're reading from a script. So I typically try to say, if you're the kind of person that does well with preparation, it's more about rehearsing it enough times that you know the words you want to say and the way you want to say them, more so than you're actually reading them, if you can help it.
Thanks. I actually share the same personal style preference, but I know some super crisp account management types who have recommended call scripting to me over the years. I've mostly worked on the creative side myself.
Yeah, I don't recommend it personally, but I think the talking, to me, it's like, these are the things I want to hit on. And then sometimes it'll be like a turn of phrase. Like, oh, I really like saying, this just happened to me today. Oh, priming the market. I was like, I need to remember to say priming the market because I think that's going to get my point across. And I just like jotted a note that I should remember to say it that way. So like, that's not really scripting, but it is like a indicator of like remembering to say it a specific way.
Love that.
And given the virtual environment and the importance of relationships and authenticity, what are the ways for folks to sort of stay approachable, stay authentic, stay comfortable while they're on camera and they're creating these interpersonal relationships? Like somebody would say, like, oh, okay, like turn your body at an angle. What do you like to do to make sure that there's still a connection between yourself and your clients?
I mean, it's such a good question. I started working with one of my clients in May of last year. So I have not met them in person, which is really rare. I try to, even if we're like geographically far, I try to at least have like that one in-person like time that you can kind of build from. So that's been interesting. One thing that I always find is funny is like, small talk is important. I don't love small talk, but like you kind of have to, because if you think about if you were in a room with 5 people or 10 people and you were all just like sitting around a conference table, like waiting for someone to show up, you would not sit there in silence or sit there on your phone or sit there with your computer open and not talk to each other. Like it would be way too awkward and it would just be like a weird moment. Like you might have pauses. But so I like try to keep myself off mute, which is, tough because obviously background noise and like people are used to just like muting when they're not talking, which is usually a good thing. But like in those environments, especially before a meeting, I try to just kind of be available and like kind of provoke a little bit of conversation. Everybody's human. And I find that the best client relationships I have are ones where I have a little bit of that like banter or openness. It makes it so that when you're in challenging moments, it's just so much easier. I have one client who I've been working with for years and like, he's very funny and he has a very dry sense of humor. And so like, we'll crack jokes or sometimes we'll be on a Zoom with a bunch of other people and he'll text me on the side and like make a joke about something. So like just kind of having that relationship. And then when I'm in a moment where I'm like, oh my God, the team is so overwhelmed. They cannot meet this deadline. And I'm really worried that they're going to end up like working all night. And I just don't want to have that happen. I can call him and say like, the team is like really overwhelmed with this, like help me reprioritize. And he's so much more open to that conversation because we've sort of started that relationship.
It establishes some trust, right? To be able to show a little of your the other side of you, right? Like not the business side.
Yeah. And in some ways, if you have a strong agency client relationship, they will then be your ally and your voice for the business. So typically there's going to be a more senior stakeholder, whether it's the CMO or, somebody in a different department or finance or whoever it is on the client side. Like you end up with a client who's speaking on your behalf in those other conversations that you're not in the room for. So that's always a plus.
What are you excited about right now, Hannah? What are you excited about? What is exciting in the world? I
am 2 weeks out from my vaccine. So the world is my oyster. As of this Saturday, I'll be 2 weeks. So that's very exciting from a personal perspective. Excited to like see family, start traveling again, all of that stuff. Yeah. From a work perspective, we just confirmed that we will be a hybrid model in the future. So we will not be in the office 5 days a week. And I'm very excited about that. I've very much enjoyed working from home, but I also really miss my coworkers. And I miss the downtime and the happy hours and all of that. And so this is like the perfect solution. We are working, I think, 2 to 3 days in the office and then the rest at home. So
are they downsizing? Are they making the footprint of the office smaller because of the hybrid model?
Most likely, yes, which is part of, I think that's a decision that every business is going through right now. Like for the most part, everyone has functioned as productively, if not more productively than we have in the past. And I think every business is going through that thought process of like the overhead costs that have been saved in this past year are phenomenal. Our company had some cost cutting measures, but we didn't lay anybody off. We just stopped our leases where we could. There was no more travel. There was there was no more sort of like happy hour budgets and just other things. And we were able to, like I said, not lay anyone off. And in fact, we actually overfunded our bonus for part of the year during this year. So I think every company is going through the thought process of like, there were a lot of positives of this like downsizing the office situation. But specifically for us, where Philly isn't our largest campus or like our largest office, we've always been out of co-working spaces. So we have a lot more flexibility.
Nice.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of organizations are going to go through, like you said, they're going to go through that review process of how did we do this year? How did our, employees do? And can we downsize some of the building infrastructure and give people a little bit more flexibility? So
yeah, people love it. I feel like I've read a bunch of like polls and articles, and people seem to be really enjoying it. At least some aspects of it. And I think that's also been a surprise. I think companies were expecting people to be eager to get back, and they're not necessarily seeing that. I think commute times, cities are changing because people are realizing they don't need to live in a city if they don't need to go into work every day. So like a lot of changes, I think, that we'll see in the next couple of years.
Absolutely.
I have one final question, and it involves books or podcasts. There's so much information out there. What have you read? It could be, a marketing book or podcast or anything that you found to be helpful in marketing or in life in general.
It's a great question. I should have been prepared for this. I feel like this is a super common question. I will not say that I am an avid reader. Partially, well, I off and on I am. My parents went to bookstore growing up, so I should like reel that back. Like I have had points in my life where I've been an avid reader, but I find personally that my work is very all consuming while I'm working, and I'm often working long hours. I try not to, but it happens. And I learn so much during the day that I personally disconnect, and I like to take a break away from those sort of professional development moments, because I find that I have so much of that and such an like enriched development at my job. I know not everyone is that way. Some people are like voracious, where they're like, I want it at work and I want it in my downtime. I'm not one of those people. But I will say I like fun podcasts that kind of tie back to it or like have a nod to it. So my favorite podcast is called Reply All. It's a podcast about the internet. It's like very loose when they say it's about the internet, because it's stories of all different things. But like sometimes it'll touch on my work and I'm like, oh, I know all about that. And then sometimes it'll be like call centers in Kansas. And I'm like, I have no idea about that. So I just find them to be funny and interesting. And I definitely did a lot of reading this past year on sort of anti-racist work. So white fragility, how to be an anti-racist, just like sort of those textbook, like I'm a white person, I need to read these things. And I felt like it was challenging, and like, that's the point. And so I always sort of recommend that. White fragility is a really, really interesting read. And I balanced that with a bunch of like sort of fluffy novels back and forth.
I love it. Sometimes you have to take the fluffy with the hard to swallow. So I appreciate you letting us know about that, because that's something that we talk about a lot, and sometimes you just don't quite know what angle to approach it at. So any help is appreciated. But that's all I have. We're at 5:59. Does anybody have any closing questions or want to say thank you or anything to Hannah before we leave? Trevor saying thank you for your time. Very insightful. Thank you, Trevor.
Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you would like to. I know you're all probably looking for your networks. Feel free to research Kepler, message me with questions. I didn't talk about this, but I did my internship in consulting, so I could also talk about that. If you have questions, feel free to message me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. It was so nice to see you, Hannah. I really enjoyed reconnecting with you here. It's so nice to see you.
Yes. Thank you everyone for joining. I know it's your Friday, so I really appreciate all the attendance.
And tell Rob we said hello too.
I will.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye, Hannah.
Have a good evening.
So much. Thank you, Trista. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.